I think we have one more special treat for you. We have Dr. Nick Haan coming up here to do a presentation. And I think Catherine Cheney will give us a little introduction about what we're about to hear.
Thank you, Kate. Hey, everybody. Well, I want Nick to mainly introduce himself because he has a pretty amazing experience to share with you, including developing some of the systems for how we talk about hunger, how we categorize famine. I got to know Nick in the Bay Area through his role with Singularity University, which he's still involved with. And one of the reasons I was so eager to have him come speak in Austin is Nick can speak both the language of Silicon Valley and the language of the humanitarian sector, the development community. It's really rare to find people who can speak both of those languages. And he has some really bold ideas for how technology can and should be leveraged to address some of the challenges we're talking about today. But he's also lived in these contexts we're talking about, so he understands the potential as well as the limits. And I just think it's a really fantastic perspective to wrap up our day of conversation. So Nick can tell you a little bit more about his background and how that ties into his perspective. Without further ado, I want to bring Nick to the stage. Please join me in welcoming him.
All right. Hello, everyone. Housekeeping. If anyone on that side of the room wants to come over here, you're more than welcome. I like seeing eyes in front of me. So feel free. There's lots of chairs. So go ahead and take 30 seconds to shift, if you will. All right. Hello, everyone. Hope you still have some energy for one last talk. Today, we're going to talk about some pretty bold concepts: famine, affluence, morality, and technology. As was already mentioned, I wear a number of different hats. I'm speaking to you on stage on behalf of what's called the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, which is a multi-partner effort to improve how food security analysis is done around the world. All those agencies that you see are partners behind that. I'm also involved with Singularity University, and I also work with a group at IOM to improve humanitarian analysis overall. So note, the viewpoints I'm about to share with you do not represent the viewpoints of the United Nations or any of these organizations whatsoever. I'm pushing the limits here a little bit, if you'll go with me. Consilience. It's a word I just learned yesterday. I'm learning every day, but I realize this is what I do. It's an agreement between approaches to a topic of different academic subjects, especially science and the humanities. We're going to mash up science and humanities here right now. And we're going to start with a philosopher, present-day philosopher, Peter Singer, who in 1971 wrote a very seminal piece called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. You notice how I'm playing off of his work. And by the way, he did not approve of this talk either, I have to say. He wrote in this essay in 1971, the first thing he wrote: "As I write this, in November 1971, people are dying in East Bengal from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. The suffering and death are not inevitable, not unavoidable, in any fatalistic sense of the term." What he wrote then is exactly true now. As we sit here in this room, there are people, and I'm going to talk specifically about Somalia in this talk, but in many parts of the world, that are dying from extreme deprivations as we speak. The challenge is, how do we change our mindsets, change our tools, change our partnerships to actually solve these problems now? Not later, not some future promise, but now, because it's doable. So Singer, he wrote out a philosophical piece, just sketched it out in this essay. And the first premise: suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad, obviously. General principle: if it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without hereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. I can prevent people's dying of starvation by giving more money to famine relief than I currently give. By giving more money to famine relief than I currently give, I would not be sacrificing anything morally comparable to the evil of dying of starvation or other deprivations. Conclusion, therefore, I ought to give much more to famine relief. And then he goes through an eloquent argument as to why that's the case, philosophically. I'm going to present to you two additional premises. And this is my reflection. This is that mashup of consilience, if you will. In this era of global connectedness, it is increasingly impossible to look away from extreme suffering anywhere in the world. We are all connected. And, number two, in this era of explosive digital innovation, it is increasingly possible to solve even the most intractable problems. We live in a world of global abundance, and technology and innovation is unlocking that. Conclusion, there's no excuse. We can and we must urgently solve famine, hunger, and all extreme deprivations. It requires a mindset shift on our parts. All of us who actually are in the business need to retool, reskill, repartner, and recommit. This is backed up by Martin Rees, famous astrophysicist, who in his book makes the case. He says, back in the 1950s, it was actually unfathomable to think that we could solve big intractable problems like hunger around the world or water deprivation around the world. We knew they existed. We just didn't really have the capacities to solve them. It's not the case now. We have the resources, the financial resources. We have the technologies. We have the innovations. And most of all, we have in Singularity University parse, we have the democratization of these technologies so people themselves are empowered to come up with solutions. The fact that we don't do it says a lot about us. So as I mentioned, I work for the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. I also work for IOM, trying to improve humanitarian analysis across multiple sectors. I just recently went on a field trip to the worst of the worst places in Somalia. And I went on this field trip in several capacities. So one, as was mentioned during my intro, I led the creation of this IPC back in almost 20 years ago, a common classification system for classifying the severity of food insecurity around the world, including famine. But by the way, famine is not an event. Famine is a complex process that we should be acting on way, way, way before we get ever to a place of famine. Side note. Number two, I got to go to the field under my capacity as working for IOM, but also I sit on a very esoteric committee, something called the Famine Review Committee. We're a 5-person committee, and we get activated whenever a country might be in famine, and we review country-level analyses to make, quote unquote, the final call as to whether or not a place is in famine. It's a very difficult job. And it's working with in a horrific subject. And it's rare, quite frankly, that I get to go to the field. So I relish this. If you look at this picture, you can probably count all the things that are wrong in that picture. And I can add more. And yet I felt privileged and honored and humbled to be able to sit there in this context, highly guarded by guns and whatnot, to be able to speak to people who are experiencing extreme destitution. Here are some more pictures. I know it's graphic. I'm not showing this to sell anything. I'm showing this to remind us that this is happening now. These are people on the brink of death, and the horrific situations that they're in now require our urgent rethink of how we do things. And then there's this picture. What do you see here? In an IDP camp, right there, smack in the middle of the IDP camp, a cell phone tower. This is the new reality. This did not exist when Peter Singer wrote his essay in 1971. Suddenly, anywhere in the world, people are empowered with digital tools. And these Somali IDPs have phones, except for the time when they get brutally robbed and raped and have them taken away. But the first thing they'll get of material value, they'll get a phone. And that hooks them up to the digital world. And when you're in the digital world, you suddenly have access to incredibly powerful technologies and opportunities. So in the humanitarian sector, if you will, there are 3 leverage points, broad leverage points. And I'm speaking very broadly. And by the way, I really appreciated whoever designed the program, these last few sessions led very nicely into this. From the specific technologies to reminding us that it's not all about technology, etc. But here are 3 broad leverage points. How we work, building sustainable infrastructure, and what I particularly get excited about, empowering resilient livelihoods, and what role technology can play in these. At the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, we took this seriously about several years ago, and we started mapping out technologies. We thought about our problem space and prioritized them, and we're underway doing innovation processes right now. And we have a whole development plan to make that happen. Forecasting using AI and modeling is a super hot field right now. A number of entities are involved. For the IPC, I'm going to do a slide plug for them. They actually just did a press release yesterday or today. They're raising funds to launch their next big program. Continuing along the line of how we work, the World Food Program was actually at the very cutting edge about 5 years ago, or maybe even more, of using blockchain for humanitarian aid distribution. And that whole field is ripe for revolution in transferring and tracking financial assistance. And then there's all these spaces for leveraging technology for building infrastructure, whether it's satellite connections themselves, cultured meat, thank you for talking about that, and other cultured products. There's no reason, by the way, why an IDP shouldn't be eating a nice, fat, juicy hamburger. No reason why she shouldn't have quality protein at all in my mind. And these technologies are going to break through. The question is, how fast can we make that happen? And what barriers are there in our own mental mindsets and models as to why that and when that should happen? IOM is actively involved in digital health, exploring that, desalination, solar panels, and the list goes on and on of breakthrough technology and innovations which will challenge our notions of what it would mean to end famine. Not now, temporarily, but permanently. And then if you think about empowering livelihoods, this is not rocket science, the 2 drivers for famine, and I study famine. I classify famines, and it's not just Somalia. It's Nigeria, it's South Sudan, it's Yemen, it's several places. And it could be here, by the way, just to remind you. We all feel secure in our food environment. Change a couple levers in the global system, and we're all hungry. The key drivers for famine are conflict and climate. Conflict and climate. Madagascar, a couple years ago, was being discussed as perhaps the first scientifically proven climate-driven famine. Whether or not that's the case, I don't know, but certainly we're in that space. In the case of Somalia, 5 consecutive failed rainy seasons, unheard of in living memory. And it's well known that 80% of 170 million acutely food insecure Africans are in conflict-affected areas. So if you're going to build sustainable livelihoods, are you really going to talk about helping people go back to marginal land farming, marginal pastoral farming, when all their livestock keep getting stolen from them over and over and can't get enough water in extreme environments? When I talked with Somali girls, when I was on that refugee camp field trip, I asked them a very strange question at the end of very long interviews. And it seemed strange even for me to ask, but I felt compelled to ask it. And that was, what are your hopes and dreams? This is when people can hardly even eat. What are your hopes and dreams? And it was always to get an education, to get a certification. It wasn't to go back to farming or go back to pastoral livelihoods. And I'm not saying that isn't part of the mix of a sustainable future. But what needs to be part of the mix are digital skills now. Because digital skills are resilient to conflict, and they are resilient to climate. And that is the future. And we can scale that up fast, and we can do it cheaply, and it's fit for the future. And there's a huge demand, unmet demand. And I know that because of a nonprofit that I also co-found called Kizo Africa. We provide digital learning skills for Africans remotely. In one of the countries, amongst, I think we have 15 countries, people, African youth who sign up, one of the countries where people continually sign up from is Somalia. It's like, how did they even find out about us? So there's a demand. I know there's a demand. And there's no reason why in refugee camps right now or IDP camps, we can't be using that as an opportunity to create safe environments for people to get digital skills. Skills you cannot take away from them, and skills which are instantly monetizable. If it works for a Filipino youth, it can work for a Somali youth. ChatGPT, crazy. We're still getting our heads around this. But if you think about the user, this is the time it took to get to 100 million users. Airbnb, 2.5 years. ChatGPT, 5 days. Why? Because when you've got that cell phone tower and you've got a phone, you're jacked up. The only barrier is knowledge and empowerment. And when you're jacked up with that, now you have people able to do all kinds of amazing things. People can be coding. People can be doing digital graphic art. All kinds of things. And I think, in my mind, it's an oversight on the humanitarian community where we're focused too much on building back to old livelihoods and not thinking about the future sustainable livelihoods. A couple more slides. Peter Singer did a thought experiment, and it was this thought experiment of a drowning child in a shallow pond. And the notion is, if you saw a drowning child, if we walk outside and there's a kid drowning in a pond, would you really walk past it, him or her? Would you really be concerned about the muddiness of your boots if you were to go in there? No. So what Peter Singer is arguing is, just like you would not walk past that child, you should not, in your mind, walk past someone suffering extreme deprivation anywhere in the world. In my mind, what needs to be added to this is we need to be deploying whatever tools we have available. And now we have digital tools. Put that in our toolbox. And it's not just about a matter of saving that drowning child and putting that child in some sort of island back in the middle of the pond and leaving him or her alone. No, it's about repositioning a place where they are able to be resilient in the future. Some take-home messages. We have a moral obligation to use all available tools, technology and other innovations, because it's not just about tech, but it is about an innovative mindset, to address famine and all other global challenges. For humanitarians in the room, there is an urgent need to develop new skills, mindsets, and partnerships. I really enjoyed that panel. Those were humanitarians up on the stage and development workers, and they're at the cutting edge of tech. They're a model for us. For the techies in the room, we need to nurture a deep understanding of the problems and context for innovation and partner with local actors. Not just assume that we have a tech looking for a problem, but understand problems and develop tech and innovations to solve that problem in the local context with local people and empower them along the way. For all of us. And this is crazy. I do this as a mental exercise to keep me healthy and optimistic about the future. And that is to reimagine what's possible during this explosive era of digital innovation. Throw off the chains of past received wisdom about what is possible, right and doable. I'm going to leave you this one last slide. This is Hawa Tako. She's a Somali freedom fighter. I first went to Somalia in 1992. I'm dating myself now. I worked for Save the Children back in 1992, in the midst of that whole Black Hawk Down fiasco. And I happened to have the opportunity to go across what's called the Green Line, the place where humanitarian people shouldn't be crossing because it's the wild, wild west out there. Went there, and in that space was the presidential palace, the residence, and the parliamentarian building. The parliamentarian building was this beautiful Italian marble building, absolutely gorgeous. And you walk into this hugely cavernous room, And it has all hundreds and hundreds of seats where the parliamentarians would sit, and in the very front of the dais, a place where the speaker would stand. Everywhere in that room had been shot up and mortared, seats ripped out, chandeliers dangling from different groups of so-called warlords, not a great term, rival militias, had come in, different groups, different clans, sub-clans had come in, and everyone had messed that place up. Behind the dais stood like a 30-foot-high mural of Hawa Taco. Here she was in this mural, standing beautifully, proudly, with her hands stretched out, breaking chains from her wrists, followed by Somali children and men, all proud of Somali independence, which represents grit and resilience, positive visions for the future. What she showed me then taught me a lot about Somali culture. But I reflect on this today as I am committed to helping solve the world's biggest challenges, snapping my own mindset. And I share that with you, the opportunity to rethink and snap the chains of our old thinking of conventional wisdom and limited visions about what is possible, empower ourselves, and reimagine a future that we all can live in. Thank you.